Hey guys, tonight we ease into something a little gentler, a little slower, and, honestly, deeply soothing if you've ever wanted to fall asleep to the sound of textile gossip and mildly dysfunctional pre-colonial craft dynasties. So go ahead, dim the lights, get tucked in, let your breathing settle. Because tonight, we're drifting into the quiet blue world of Yoruba indigo dyeing families. The people whose entire lives revolved around coaxing color out of plants, weaving cloth that could last generations, and managing household politics with the same slow patience that they used to manage their dye pits. So, just relax, take a slow breath, and let's wander into one of the calmest industries in West African history. The first thing to know about Yoruba indigo houses is that they were not houses in the cozy, grandma knits sweaters and bakes cookies sense. They were more like calm textile fortresses built on routine, repetition, and the faint smell of fermented dye. These were multi-generational compounds where entire families moved to the rhythm of cloth production. And no one ever seemed to be in a hurry. Everything was slow, intentional, borderline sleepy, which, honestly, is perfect for us tonight. And by houses, we're also talking about a whole system: loom rooms, dye pits, storage sheds, courtyards full of women beating cloth on wooden slabs, and that one uncle who always acted like he invented weaving even though he mostly sat around chewing cola nut. Every family had one. Of course they did. But let's float back to the beginning. Long before European traders showed up along the West African coast asking awkward questions, Yoruba communities already had a deeply rooted textile culture. Indigo dyeing wasn't just a craft, it was a whole identity. The plant itself, elu, was grown like a prized garden queen. Indigo producers guarded their dye recipes like royal secrets, passed from mothers to daughters in a tone that said, "Don't mess this up, or your cloth is going to come out looking like swamp water." And yes, they did actually talk like that. Politely, calmly, but very seriously. The indigo houses were usually run by women, and if you imagine them as serene textile matriarchs, that's pretty accurate. These were women who spent their whole lives managing vats of fermented dye without ever seeming stressed, even though the pits absolutely reeked. They had that unbothered energy of people who have seen everything and will not be surprised by anything anymore. Not even the time a goat wandered into the courtyard and fell halfway into a dye pit, which happened more often than you'd think. But the real centerpiece of these households? The looms. Yoruba looms were narrowband looms, long wooden structures where cloth grew inch by inch, stripe by stripe, with a rhythm that could lull even the loudest villager into a nap. Picture a long shed filled with these instruments, each one clacking gently like a heartbeat. Young men worked the looms, partly because it required upper body strength, and partly because it let older weavers sit around and supervise with the smugness of people who used to be fast back in the day. These loom houses were like calm, sleepy factories. Instead of the whirring chaos you might imagine from industrial settings, the Yoruba version was just steady, peaceful. The weavers sat in long lines, their legs extended beneath the frames, their hands moving in the same motions their fathers and grandfathers made. Cloth grew slowly, almost meditatively. And yes, families passed down their favorite patterns like treasure. Some were so old that even the elders had no idea who invented them, which didn't stop anyone from claiming credit anyway. Oh yes, that was your great-great-great-uncle's design. Sure, the man probably just liked stripes. Meanwhile, the dye pits were their own sleepy universe. Indigo dyeing is a fermentation process, which means the color only develops after soaking in vats that smell like a wet forest married a brewery. Women stirred these pits with thick sticks, sometimes humming, sometimes lecturing younger apprentices about patience. And patience was everything. You couldn't rush indigo. You couldn't speed up fermentation. You couldn't force the cloth to accept the color. You just dipped it, waited, let it oxidize in the open air, and repeated the process again. And again. And again. No drama, no urgency. Just blue slowly deepening like dusk settling over the compound. And apprentices learned slow lessons. The first cloth they dyed always came out blotchy, and they always panicked, and the elder women always gave the same answer: yes, that is life. Do it again. This was the timeless rhythm of Yoruba indigo houses. Daily tasks repeated so regularly that time itself felt woven into the cloth. But while the work was calm, the social dynamics could get interesting. In a sleepy way. For example, because dye making was considered a sacred female craft, it came with a hierarchy sharper than a newly carved comb. Senior dyers guarded the best vats like jealous dragons. They would tell younger women, "You're not ready yet," in the same tone modern office workers reserve for, "We're not giving you the password to that spreadsheet." And then there were the weavers, mostly men, who believed that without them there would be no cloth, which was technically true but still didn't impress the dyers, who knew full well that without them there would be no color. Thus, a gentle rivalry developed, with occasional petty comments that made family gatherings extra entertaining. Picture a very calm argument. "Yes, you make the cloth, but it is naked until I dye it. Yes, you dye the cloth, but it is shapeless until I weave it." And everyone else sitting around eating roasted yam while pretending not to listen. What held it all together? Routine, tradition, and a mild obsession with order. Because in these textile houses, everything, and I mean everything, had its place. The indigo leaves were sorted into piles. The pots were aligned in neat rows. The looms were arranged so that no one's shuttle would accidentally fly into anyone else's work, which still happened from time to time, causing very quiet irritation. The Yoruba valued aesthetics deeply, not only in finished cloth but in daily spaces. Dye tools weren't just functional, they were maintained like beloved pets. Looms were cleaned regularly, rubbed with oil to prevent cracking, and decorated with tiny charms meant to keep them from getting tired. Because yes, tools could get spiritually exhausted in Yoruba cosmology. And honestly, same. Let's float now towards something slightly more personal. The people who spent their lives in these indigo compounds weren't always the serene artisans they appeared. Behind the calm surfaces were family tensions, ambitious apprentices, rival workshops, and the occasional scandal involving someone borrowing another family's pattern. One of the classic annoyances was that families guarded their methods fiercely. So if a daughter married into a different dyeing household, she was expected not to share her mother's old techniques. Imagine the passive-aggressive energy involved in those transitions. The mother quietly hoping her daughter wouldn't betray the lineage. The in-laws watching her like hawks to see if she had secret knowledge worth extracting. You could practically hear the subtext. "So, how did your mother get that shade of deep blue?" "Oh, just patience." The long patience or the short patience? The normal patience. And everyone pretending they were absolutely not fishing for trade secrets. One of the most calming but also slightly amusing parts of the whole tradition was how the cloth was finished. After dyeing, women beat the cloth on wide wooden slabs to make it shiny. They used flat wooden paddles and hit the cloth rhythmically, almost musically, turning the courtyard into a soft percussion chamber. Children often fell asleep listening to it, which, yes, is adorable, but the women beating the cloth usually used the time to discuss local gossip in extremely quiet, extremely pointed voices. No one gossiped more calmly than Yoruba textile women. They could absolutely tear someone apart socially while still gently polishing a bolt of cloth. A soft, "Did you hear she mixed the wrong vat last week?" could sound both like a whisper and a public execution. Meanwhile, older men occasionally wandered into the courtyard offering their opinions even though no one asked. A retired weaver always had that, "I could fix that warp if I wanted to" energy. And yet, no one stopped them. Let them talk. It was all part of the unhurried life of the compound, a slow-moving constellation of roles, responsibilities, whispers, and traditions that made these indigo houses feel like living organisms. Cloth wasn't just cloth. It was a timeline, a family archive, a record of who learned what and from whom, and how carefully they preserved the teachings. And the blue, Yoruba Indigo Blue, had a softness to it, a deep, dark, breathable hue. When the long cloth strips were finally sewn together, they became wrappers, shawls, ceremonial garments, even armor-like layers for hunters. Indigo was everywhere. It was a signature, a comfort, constant. And through all of this ran the slow, steady work of people who rarely rushed. The dye pits bubbled, the looms clacked, The cloth dried in the sun like rows of calm, blue waterfalls. Sometimes, on market days, entire families walked to the trading stalls carrying bundles of finished fabric balanced on their heads. The oldest woman usually led the procession, walking at a pace so slow you'd think she was trying to avoid arriving. But really, she was just moving with dignity, and perhaps making sure everyone behind her stayed in line. Markets were never chaotic for textile sellers. They set up under shade, arranged their cloth in neat folds, and waited. Customers came, admired the patterns, commented on the depth of the blue, asked whether this was the long patience or the short patience dye, and haggled in a tone so relaxed it barely counted as negotiation. A few buyers demanded discounts for no reason. Others wanted special patterns that nobody made anymore. One person per week claimed their grandmother made cloth exactly like this, which was usually a lie but was considered polite conversation. Through it all, the textile families remained steady, almost meditative, even when rival families tried to outshine them. Because yes, textile rivalry was a thing, they responded with that classic Yoruba subtlety, a carefully raised eyebrow and a firm belief that their indigo was obviously superior. This gentle confidence carried them through generations. Indigo craft wasn't just a job. It was lineage, livelihood, spirituality, and aesthetic all wrapped into one. A slow craft, a soft craft, a craft that shaped entire towns like Oshobo, Abeokuta, and Ibadan. By the 19th century, some Yoruba weavers became minor celebrities within their communities, known for their flawless stripes or their impossibly deep blues. One old weaver was said to talk to his loom so much that people began to wonder whether the loom talked back. It probably didn't, but nobody wanted to interrupt him to check. Indigo houses carried quiet pride. They rarely boasted, but they didn't need to. Their work spoke in calm blue. And tonight, we're just beginning our drift through this universe. In the next chapters, we'll wander deeper into the daily frustrations, the soft feuds, the dye queen matriarchs who ruled their pits like sleep-deprived empresses, the awkward sons who desperately wanted to weave better than their brothers, and the little dramas between neighboring compounds. For now, let's pause here, letting the slow rhythm of the looms settle in the mind like soft evening wind. The indigo houses of Yoruba towns were calm, yes, but they were also quietly ruled by women who had mastered the art of looking serene while controlling everything within a 50-meter radius. These were the dye matriarchs, elders whose hands were permanently stained a soft blue, whose posture suggested decades of leaning over vats, and whose expressions carried the patient disappointment of someone who had explained the fermentation process too many times to too many people. A dye matriarch didn't need to shout. She didn't even raise an eyebrow often. A slight pause in her stirring, a tiny shift in her breathing, and everyone knew that someone had messed something up. Usually an apprentice, and usually a very basic mistake. Something like dipping the cloth too quickly or lifting it too slowly. Indigo is all about timing, and apprentices are, historically, terrible at timing. But the matriarchs kept everything moving, calmly, deeply, with a patience that could outlast seasonal rainfall patterns. If the dye pit was unbalanced, she fixed it. If cloth came out mottled, she pointed out the exact reason in a tone so soft it felt like a bedtime story about chemical reactions. Her knowledge wasn't written down. It lived in gestures, glances, and muscle memory. She could tell the state of a vat by smell alone, which impressed everyone except the very young, who didn't appreciate how many years it took to learn that skill. The pits fermented differently depending on weather, humidity, the mood of the household, and possibly the moon, depending on whom you asked. Apprentices didn't learn by reading. They learned by watching the matriarch, which meant hours of standing in the courtyard pretending to be alert while gradually drifting toward sleep. More than one apprentice was lightly tapped awake with the stirring stick. The matriarchs weren't cruel, they simply believed in attentiveness, and quiet, and order, and dye that didn't look like it was having an identity crisis. Let's glide to another corner of the compound. In most houses, the matriarch rarely worked alone. She was surrounded by daughters, younger sisters, nieces, and those mysterious cousins who appeared every few market seasons and claimed to be related. Together they formed a small indigo cabinet of decision-making, a slow-moving committee that considered every matter with the same seriousness they applied to adjusting dye concentrations. Who would take cloth to market this week? Who was ready to move from stirring duty to dipping duty? Which apprentice might eventually become a full dyer? They discussed these questions with the energy of a sleepy Senate hearing. Each woman offered an opinion, usually beginning with, "Well, in my experience," followed by a soft, detailed explanation that didn't change anyone's mind. Decisions were already made. The discussions were just ritual. Behind this gentle bureaucracy was a core truth. Dyeing was generational power. Women controlled it. They defined who learned what, who improved when, and who needed more seasoning, which was a polite way of saying, "Please don't ruin the vats this week." And beneath all this control was a cultural principle. The dye pits were sacred. Literally sacred. They were treated as living spirits. The matriarchs made offerings to them. Palm oil, prayers, a murmured request for even color. Children weren't allowed to play near the pits, partly for safety and partly because the dye spirit had a reputation for disliking chaos. Let's move lightly to the loom sheds now, where the mood was slightly different. The weavers, mostly men, worked in long rows under thatched roofs. Their hands moved with steady rhythm, but the sound itself was a kind of soft percussion. Wooden parts tapping, shuttles gliding, threads snapping into place. It was rhythmic enough that even the men sometimes drifted into a meditative state. Weaving required its own hierarchy, and yes, it had its own version of matriarch energy, except delivered through older male weavers who had the peculiar mix of confidence and mild delusion common to men who had spent 50 years telling younger people how to sit correctly. They were called Agba Akno, senior weavers. And while not as universally respected as dye matriarchs, they still held influence. They trained boys from childhood, often claiming that weaving built character, though really it just built good posture and an ability to ignore back pain. These senior weavers had preferences they treated like divine law. The warp must be tight, but not too tight. The shuttle must glide, but not too lightly. The stripes must align, but not look overly suspicious about it. The younger weavers rolled their eyes internally but followed directions anyway. Because in a loom house, disapproval was delivered silently, with the slow shake of a head, the deep sigh of someone who had woven through 3 wars and a famine, and the soft muttering, "In our day, shuttles didn't fall to the floor like this." Let's float over to the courtyard once more, where the finishing work took place. After cloth was dyed, rinsed, dried, and admired, it still needed one more step: beating. Beating made the cloth shiny and smooth. It was done by women sitting in a line, each holding a wooden paddle and striking the cloth in slow, steady rhythm. The sound carried through the compound, thump, 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 as comforting as a heartbeat. It lulled babies asleep. It settled arguments. It even made goats calm, which is a rare miracle. The beating sessions also became group therapy for the women. They talked about everything: market gossip, marital annoyances, household politics, and which dye pit was being moody this week. They aired grievances in the gentlest way possible, with phrases like, "I did not appreciate what she said, but it is between her and her ancestors." Every once in a while someone would mention that a rival family down the street was producing too much cloth too quickly, which sounded like admiration but was actually criticism. No one trusted cloth made in a hurry. Cloth needed time to develop softness, the way people needed time to develop wisdom. Now and then, a cloth would be so beautifully dyed and beaten that the entire courtyard paused to admire it. Someone would hold it up to the sun, letting the deep indigo glow, and the group would nod as if approving a newborn child. Of course, there was also jealousy. Quiet jealousy. The kind that showed through a very faint, very polite comment such as, "This blue is nice. Almost too nice." Perhaps the pit was unusually generous today. Let's drift gently into the topic of cloth symbolism. Yoruba cloth wasn't just decorative. Patterns had meanings. A stripe arrangement might say wealth. Another might say marriage. Another pattern, usually involving alternating thick and thin lines, could subtly imply your lineage has good taste and probably decent ancestors. And of course, some patterns expressed grief or transition. But the most prized cloths often had personal stories attached to them. A young weaver might create a pattern inspired by something he saw at market, maybe a particularly arrogant rooster or a piece of pottery that didn't look quite symmetrical. He'd weave the idea into cloth, and the elders would tilt their heads and say, "Interesting," which could mean either admiration or confusion. The matriarchs also had favorite patterns, many of them old enough that the original designers were just names in memory. When apprentices were given the responsibility to reproduce these designs, they approached it with near-religious caution. Messing up a family pattern was a mild social tragedy. Not catastrophic, just embarrassing. The kind of mistake that would get talked about for years in extremely calm voices. Let's glide further into the social world around indigo. Every textile compound had its alliances and rivalries. Some were friendly. Families shared dye tips, exchanged apprentices, or collaborated on large commissions for ceremonies. Others were less friendly, trading soft insults at market in the form of, "Oh, your cloth is very bold. A brave shade of blue. Very brave." Competition wasn't aggressive, it was refined. A rival might casually hang their cloth at a slightly more flattering angle to catch the sunlight better. Another might mention, in a tone that wasn't quite casual, that their new dye pit was quite strong this season. It was the textile version of humble bragging. The matriarchs kept these rivalries under control with a simple philosophy: produce good cloth, mind your vats, and let the spirits handle everything else. The weavers, meanwhile, occasionally engaged in low-grade sniping about who truly understood stripe alignment, as if it were an advanced branch of mathematics. But the heart of it all, the real center, was the flow of life inside the compound walls. Children learning to sort thread by color. Teenagers practicing their first awkward dye dips. Old men weaving slowly, savoring the rhythm. Women discussing lineage, household matters, and cloth that needed one more beating. Through ordinary moments, a whole world of craft was sustained. Let's drift to a late evening scene now. The sun has dropped low, turning the courtyard gold. The dye pits have been covered for the night. Cloth hangs drying, gently moving in the warm breeze. The looms are silent. A few apprentices sit on stools, half awake, listening to elders tell stories about the early days when indigo pits were dug with nothing but wooden shovels. The matriarch sits nearby, her eyes closed but her mind awake, sensing whether the vats will need feeding tomorrow. The air smells faintly of fermented leaves. A goat wanders through, hoping for leftover cassava. There is no rush, no urgency. Not tonight. The world of indigo moves slowly, always in its own time. And just like that, we've brushed against the daily life of the dye matriarchs and their households, a soft, steady universe unfolding in blue threads. Life inside a Yoruba indigo compound might look serene from the outside, but it was also filled with characters. People whose personal quirks added a gentle, sleepy chaos to the otherwise rhythmic calm. Every loom house had at least one weaver whose life was basically a long series of small, quiet disasters. The kind that weren't dramatic enough to interrupt the workflow, but definitely dramatic enough for everyone to talk about later in low voices. Let's drift into the loom shed first, where the air is thick with wood dust and the soft clack of shuttles. If you walked through the rows of weavers, you'd eventually meet someone like Cunnel, the man every compound had in some form. Cunnel was that one weaver who insisted he had the most precise hands in the family, despite producing more crooked stripes than anyone else. His confidence was admirable. His accuracy was theoretical. He sat at the far end of the shed, where the light wasn't too bright, and claimed this was because weaving requires spiritual focus. It was probably because he preferred not to be watched. But nobody corrected him. They just let him talk. Whenever his shuttle slipped from his fingers, which it did daily, he sighed loudly, letting the entire compound know that fate, not his poor technique, was to blame. The older weavers responded with the slow, resigned nods of people who had long accepted that Cunnel was a lifelong apprentice, no matter how old he got. Next to him sat his cousin, Edigboju, a man who could weave perfectly straight lines while half asleep. Literally half asleep. His eyes drooped. His head bobbed. But his hands kept moving. He was like a calm weaving machine powered entirely by muscle memory and mild exhaustion. No one understood how he did it. Some said he was guided by ancestors. Others said he was simply too tired to make mistakes. The loom shed, as always, was a place of unhurried companionship. Weavers spoke in soft voices, usually about things that didn't matter: weather patterns, dreams they had last night, goats behaving strangely. No topic was too small. One man spent an entire month discussing a yam that grew in the shape of a question mark. Another believed his loom creaked at night because it missed him. No one corrected him either. Then there were the quiet competitions. A weaver might casually point out that his stripes seemed particularly vibrant that week. Another might hum just loudly enough to imply his cloth had the better pattern. All very peaceful, of course. The kind of rivalry where the worst insult anyone would use was, "That weft looks adventurous." Still, loom sheds weren't immune to emotional moments. The biggest disasters were never loud. They happened slowly, like a gentle tragedy unfolding in yarn. A weaver might miscalculate a warp tension, leading to cloth that drifted slightly left. Not a catastrophe, but enough to produce faintly mocking eyebrow raises from older weavers. Or a spool of thread might roll into a crack in the floor, requiring long, slow negotiations with gravity and frustration. The shed would fall into sympathetic silence until the spool was retrieved, usually with a stick, a prayer, and the help of 3 bystanders offering contradictory advice. Let's float over to the dye pits, where the personalities were just as rich, but softened by indigo fumes and a very specific kind of patience. Every compound had one apprentice who couldn't smell the difference between a healthy vat and a vat on the verge of rebellion. This was a problem because experienced dyers judged the pits by scent: earthy, fermented, mildly swampy, but pleasantly so. A misbalanced pit, however, smelled like it was planning to ruin someone's entire week. One such apprentice, let's call her Sod, had a calm optimism that never matched the state of the vats she monitored. She would dip a cloth, pull it out, and frown softly at the pale, washed-out blue. Then she'd dip it again, and again. Eventually the matriarch would shuffle over, take one small sniff, and say, in the kindest disappointed tone possible, "My daughter, this pit has been sleeping for 2 days." Sod would nod, bow her head, and promise to listen better next time. She meant it. She always meant well. But her sense of vat smell never improved, and the compound simply accepted that she would need supervision for the rest of her dyeing career. Meanwhile, there was always one dyer who took the spiritual side of the craft very seriously. Too seriously, according to some. This person, usually an older woman named something like Mama Indi, could spend half the morning whispering to the vats, negotiating with them as though they were temperamental relatives. She made tiny offerings, rearranged the tools for energy flow, and insisted that dyeing cloth during certain moon phases gave better results. Nobody argued with her, mostly because her cloth was consistently good. Even the skeptics admitted that whatever she was doing worked, though they also believed she might just be naturally gifted and enjoying the extra drama. Let's ease ourselves toward the courtyard, where the cloth was beaten into smoothness and where small domestic melodramas unfolded at the slowest pace imaginable. One of the regular characters in these compounds was the over-enthusiastic beater, a woman who struck the cloth with slightly too much force, making the paddles clap loudly enough to cause mild disturbance in the otherwise peaceful rhythm. Everyone pretended not to mind, but the matriarch always gave her a gentle look, a look that said, "Your enthusiasm is noted, please reduce." Another courtyard personality was the woman who shared gossip that wasn't actually information, just vague statements delivered with great seriousness, such as, "Something is happening in that family," without clarifying what the something was. The others nodded sagely as if understanding the mystery, though none of them did. Children wandered through constantly, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Why is the cloth blue? Why do the pits smell like that? Why does the loom make that noise? Why does Uncle Cunnel weave sideways? The adults usually responded with profound-sounding phrases like, "Life is full of mysteries," which translated to, "Please stop talking and let us work." Let's shift into another corner, the storage room. Textile compounds treated their storage rooms like vaults. Stacks of folded cloth lined the walls in careful piles that senior women guarded with the intensity of librarians. No one entered without permission, and if someone did, even by accident, they would feel a silent wave of disapproval wash over them like a cool breeze. It wasn't that anyone feared theft. Cloth wasn't usually stolen in these households. It was more that folded cloth represented months of effort, and touching it with unapproved hands was considered an act of pure chaos energy. Among the stored cloth were pieces reserved for special ceremonies, festivals, marriages, funerals, and the occasional political event. These were handled with reverence. Apprentices were reminded, endlessly, to lift them like you're lifting your future. Of course, there was also the one irresponsible young weaver who always forgot where he put his finished cloth. He'd wander around the compound asking whether anyone had seen the wrapper with the slightly uneven stripes. There were always several, but eventually, someone would find his work under a stool or behind a pot, and he'd respond with an unearned look of pride. Let's drift gently into the social sphere beyond the compound walls. Weavers and dyers didn't just make cloth, they lived their identities. During festivals, they dressed in their finest indigo wrappers, walking with the dignified air of people who created beauty from plants and patience. Indigo artisans were respected, sought after, even mildly envied. That didn't stop them from judging each other's festival outfits. A dyer might whisper, "Her blue is very bright this season," which was a coded compliment. Or, she used the quick method, which was a polite insult. Men compared stripe patterns the way some people compare horses or farmland. This one is kingly. This one is for everyday use. This one looks like the weaver had many thoughts on his mind. Nobody ever said crooked. Not directly. They just said thoughtful. Let's return once more to the compound at dusk, when the day's work slowed to a gentle end. The vats darkened under their covers. The looms fell still. The courtyard quieted except for the soft thumps of the last cloth being beaten. Apprentices tidied tools with exaggerated care, hoping to earn approval. Elders found their favorite stools and eased into them with long, satisfied sighs. This was the time when stories were shared. Old weavers told tales of legendary patterns created long before the current generation was born. Dyers spoke of mythical moments when vats produced colors, so deep the night became jealous. No one believed these stories completely, but everyone enjoyed them. And through it all, the quirky inhabitants of the Indigo House, Kunnel with his crooked stripes, Sod with her confused vat senses, Mama Indi with her spiritual negotiations, wove their small imperfections into the life of the compound. Their flaws weren't problems. They were simply part of the rhythm. Not excitement, not drama, just soft, human texture in a world of blue threads. Let's drift into another corner of the indigo world. Nothing loud. Nothing dramatic, just another gentle step through a life shaped by color, cloth, and the slow, rhythmic push of a loom. Tonight, we're floating toward the households of women who carried entire dyeing and weaving economies on shoulders that never quite got any thanks for it. That's the thing about pre-colonial Yoruba commerce. The names of kings echo everywhere. The names of the women who actually built the economies, not so much. But their stories are there, quietly woven into every robe a chief ever wore. So in this chapter, we settle in with one of them. Not a queen, not a princess, just a woman who did far more practical work than either of those titles required. A woman I'll call Aridunyu, because her real name, like many in women's textile histories, slipped out of the record the same way loose dye slips out of the first rinse bucket. She lived somewhere in the mid-19th century, in a town that wasn't particularly famous. Which honestly works out nicely for our vibe because it means nothing explosive ever happened there. No major wars. No palace scandals. Just a lot of cotton dust and the hum of trade courtyards. Aridunyu was born into a weaving compound. This already meant that her childhood was basically one long tutorial. Other kids were learning how to sneak palm fruit snacks without adults noticing. She was learning how to align heddles so neatly that older aunties would yell, "Good, good, your hands are calm like your grandmother's." And her grandmother, apparently, was the sort of woman who could weave a straight line even through childbirth contractions. Because of course she was. Her grandmother's ghost hung around the family like every matriarchal legend does, subtly judgmental but supportive enough that you felt obligated to keep your posture straight while working. Whenever Aridunyu messed up the alignment of a thread, the older women would say, "Ah, your grandmother would never have allowed that." They said it with love. Mostly. Growing up, Aridunyu learned early that Yoruba weaving compounds had an interesting social structure. They weren't quite families. They weren't quite guilds. They were some warm, complicated mixture of the two. You'd have blood relatives, married-in relatives, adopted apprentices, random children who wandered in during lunch and never left. And yet somehow, the compound functioned like a disciplined workshop. A very chatty, gossip-rich workshop. And for young weavers, gossip was basically background music. Light, rhythmic, imperfectly factual. Stories about an uncle's uncle who once got into an argument about a dye pot and ended up staining his rival's goat blue for 6 weeks. Or a neighbor who claimed she had invented a new pattern but actually just forgot she saw it at market. These tales floated through Aridunyu's childhood like the scent of warmed indigo cakes. By the time she hit her late teens, she'd mastered the basics. Straight weaves, balanced tension, threading the narrow strip loom without stabbing herself with the shuttle. A real accomplishment, honestly. It was around this time that she began working inside the indigo houses, the quiet, semi-enclosed courtyards where dyeing happened. They were peaceful in that slow, thick way that warm air can be peaceful. Women dipped, stirred, hummed, and didn't really bother with the idea of rushing. Indigo doesn't rush. Indigo insists. Aridunyu was put in charge of stirring one of the fermentation pots. This is basically the dye world equivalent of being trusted with someone's newborn. Indigo vats are emotional creatures. Too much stirring and they sulk. Too little stirring and they spoil. The dye matriarchs would hover nearby, pretending not to supervise, while absolutely supervising. "Let the bubbles rise on their own," one would murmur. "Tap gently," another would say. "Not like that," a third would whisper a little too loudly. Despite all this supervision by stealth, Aridunyu did well. She had a patience that made older women nod approvingly, the same way librarians approve of children who naturally speak softly. Her first few months in the dye house were mostly uneventful, which is exactly the kind of energy we want. Uneventful decades are the foundation of every stable textile economy. Every morning, she would sweep the indigo courtyard. The sweeping itself was a low, rhythmic movement that felt almost like stage setting, quieting the world before the day's color work began. She would check the vats, feed the fermentation, fold cloth bundles, tie resist patterns, and then, when the dye matriarchs were satisfied, she would lower the first cloth of the day into the vat. It always felt the same: slow descent, the faint resistance of liquid thickness, and then the cloth vanishing beneath a murky surface that looked nothing like the final blue. When she pulled it out, the cloth would be yellowish. This never stopped being magical. Yellow cloth turning blue because it touched air. Blue appearing like a shy personality warming up. One of the older women explained it to her every single week, even though she already knew the chemistry by heart. "That is the breath of Oran," the woman said. "Air wakes the color." Aridunyu nodded respectfully every time. She didn't have the heart to say she'd heard the same metaphor 12 times that month. Life in the compound moved gently. No major plot twists. No secret betrayals. Just a slow apprenticeship that deepened year by year. And in this softness, her weaving skills matured. She practiced late into the night, listening to the crickets and the faint laughter of neighbors returning from market. She began experimenting with patterns, though nothing too flashy, just little variations the aunties might call interesting, but don't push your luck. Eventually, she was entrusted with a full cloth commission for a local merchant's wife. This was a big deal because merchant wives were notoriously picky. They wanted patterns that whispered wealth, not shouted it. Aridunyu delivered exactly what they wanted. Smooth strips, clean edges, indigo that was rich but not dramatic. The merchant's wife looked over the finished piece, nodded once, and said, "Good." That was basically the Yoruba textile equivalent of applause. From there, commissions trickled in. Not a flood, just enough to add a calm sense of purpose to her days. She wasn't weaving for prestige. She wasn't aiming for court robes or masquerade cloths. Her work was domestic, useful, beautiful in a quiet way, which honestly matched her life's whole aesthetic. As she entered adulthood, her world expanded in small, steady increments. She joined other women on trading trips, carrying cloth bundles to markets in neighboring towns. These walks were slow, talk-heavy, and filled with discussions about the price of thread, the behavior of husbands, and the endless debate of whether fermented indigo smelled comforting or just aggressively present. On one of these trips, they stopped at a loom house belonging to a family known for weaving extremely thin strips. So thin they looked like the cloth equivalent of careful breathing. Aridunyu watched the weavers working in polite silence, feeling a little intimidated by the perfection of their craft. One of the older women leaned over to her and whispered, "Don't be impressed. They only weave like this because their grandfather was too stubborn to make normal looms." Out of respect for the grandfather's ghost, or possibly because they feared the ghost overheard, the weavers pretended they didn't hear that comment. Aridunyu eventually incorporated some of their techniques into her own weaving. Not to compete, just to understand the flow of their style. That was her quiet genius. She absorbed techniques without absorbing the ego that often traveled with them. Back in her home compound, she took on her own apprentices. Young girls who had never touched a loom before. Girls who asked questions like, "Why can't I weave lying down?" And "Can't we just dye it all at once and fix the mistakes later?" She answered patiently, always patiently, even when one apprentice accidentally dropped a cloth bundle into the wrong dye bath. The result was a shade of green so chaotic that even the dye matriarchs had no metaphor for it. "Ah," one of them said softly, "this is something." Aridunyu laughed for the first time in weeks. A tiny laugh, perfectly safe for bedtime listening. Then she turned the mistake into practice cloth and kept going. Her life was not glamorous, not royal, not the kind of life that shows up in textbooks or museums. But she existed at the heart of a tradition that flowed through Yoruba towns for centuries. Indigo houses weren't decorative cultural spaces. They were living economies. Their pace set the rhythm of daily survival. And Aridunyu, without ever becoming particularly famous, kept that rhythm steady. She grew older. Her hands grew surer. Her apprentices grew competent enough to earn their own commissions. The gossip in the dye house grew more about grandchildren and less about dramatic neighbor disputes. Occasionally, she heard stories about elite families commissioning vast, elaborate cloths. Cloths made for coronations. Cloths paraded during festivals. Cloths destined for people whose lives were never quiet. She never envied them. She didn't want a palace. She didn't want prestige. She wanted her loom, her courtyard, her dye vats, and the gentle, dependable slowness that had shaped her life from childhood. The last weaving she completed was a simple wrapper cloth with a soft, repeated pattern. Nothing bold, nothing experimental. Just the sort of cloth women wore daily. The kind of cloth that absorbed presence rather than demanding it. A few weeks before she died, she told her oldest apprentice, "Weaving is like breathing. You just keep doing it, even when you don't think about it." That was the closest she ever came to philosophy. Her loom was passed on. Her dye tools distributed. Her patterns imitated quietly by newer hands. Nothing monumental, nothing royal, nothing dramatic. Just another thread in an old, continuous textile tradition. And that is exactly why her presence matters. Not because she changed the world, but because she helped keep it moving, softly, steadily, inch by inch on a loom that never rushed. Let's drift onward, gliding from one indigo-scented doorway to another, and step, very gently, into the life of someone who lived a little closer to the political edge. Not exactly royalty. Not exactly a commoner. Just one of those middle ground figures who spent their entire existence caught between the expectations of rulers and the realities of making sure people had enough cloth to wrap around their bodies. His name was Alawowena, and unlike many of the women whose names vanished into vats and loom houses, his happened to get attached to a few trade records. mostly because he annoyed enough important people that they wrote about him. Not dramatically annoyed, just steady, persistent, administrative-level annoyance. The kind of irritation that leaves no bruises, only paperwork. Alawawena was a dyer's son, a loomhouse wanderer, a child who grew up listening to his mother and aunties argue over vat temperatures with the intensity other families reserved for inheritance disputes. Indigo fermentation was basically the family religion, and his childhood memories were a collage of lime, ash, crushed leaves, and the alarming awareness that an indigo vat could ruin your social schedule if you mistreated it. But he wasn't a quiet child like Eridunyu or the typical weaving compound apprentice. Alawawena spent most of his youth offering unsolicited opinions about vat placement, loom tension, and the inefficiencies of hand-twisting thread. He was, in short, the kind of kid who absolutely grew up to become a bureaucrat. Not an elite one. Not a palace-level big man. Just the local trade official who walked around markets with a slow, deliberate step and a tiny, judgmental frown that suggested someone, somewhere, was not paying proper textile levies. His job was as humble as it sounds. He was responsible for monitoring cloth quantities, weighing blue-dyed bundles, checking for counterfeit dye cakes, and recording which merchants passed through the town gates. It was not glamorous. It was not respected. It was, however, stable. And he clung to stability the way a shuttle clings to its groove. Alawawena took this role in his early 20s, after discovering that he could not weave, could not dye, could not spin thread without snarling it, and could not sweep the compound without raising more dust than he removed. His mother, tired of the chaos, essentially guided him toward the trade office and told him, "Sit here. Write things down. Don't touch the vats." He obeyed, mostly because writing things down gave him a sense of cosmic authority. The trade post itself was a shady corner hut beside the market. A small, square room stacked with bamboo slips, palm leaf records, and a ledger that had existed since before he was born. The handwriting of at least 8 different record keepers tangled across its pages. Neat, slanted, barely legible, and occasionally overconfident. Alawawena added his own script, steady, medium-sized, and slightly pretentious. He grew surprisingly influential, not through charisma, he had none, or inheritance, he had even less, but through consistency. You could rely on him to be exactly where he was yesterday, wearing the same neutral expression, asking the same dry questions. How many bundles today? Full or partial strip cloth? Which dye house did this shade come from? Noted. He was a calm, unflappable presence, perfect for bedtime storytelling. He was also the man who made sure the town didn't get cheated by traveling merchants who tried to pass off badly dyed cloth as premium work. He didn't yell or accuse. He simply pressed his lips together in a disappointed line and wrote something in his ledger. The disappointment alone usually corrected behavior. He became particularly focused on counterfeit dye cakes. These were blocks of compressed plant matter mixed with ash and sometimes colored with minerals instead of genuine fermented indigo. Merchants occasionally attempted to sneak them into local markets because genuine indigo cakes were expensive, labor-heavy, and notoriously moody. Alawawena, however, had what the dye house women called nose of destiny. He could smell a fake cake from across the courtyard. It wasn't that he had supernatural abilities. It was that he had spent his entire childhood inhaling indigo fumes, ash dust, and lye water steam. His nose could detect discrepancies the way a cat detects suspicious furniture rearrangements. He would murmur softly as he picked up a cake. This one lacks soul, which was his roundabout way of saying it smelled wrong. People eventually stopped trying to cheat him. His one great ambition, oddly enough, was to standardize the town's cloth measurements. Different families used slightly different methods, some measured by arm span, some by fixed sticks, some by a very confusing system involving wrapped knots and counting breaths. Alawawena saw this and thought, yes, this is what I shall dedicate my life to. And he did. He drafted proposals, charts, tables, written guidelines gently suggesting that perhaps, just maybe, the town might consider adopting a unified measuring rod. Nothing dramatic, nothing transformative, Just consistent lengths that did not require interpretive dance to calculate. People ignored him for 2 years. He kept writing. Eventually, one of the senior town chiefs, exhausted by a particularly confusing trade dispute, said, "Fine, let him have his rod." And so Alawawena received his greatest joy, a carved, officially sanctioned cloth measuring staff, marked in calm little increments. He carried it everywhere, even when unnecessary. Even at festivals. Even to weddings. His mother once asked, "Must you bring that to dinner?" "Yes," he replied. "I'm testing humidity effects." He was not testing humidity effects. He just liked holding it. Alawawena's personal life was predictably uneventful. He married a woman named Bamadil, who was equally calm and equally unbothered by his fixation on measurements. She came from a dying family, so she already understood the emotional swings of VAT-based economies. Compared to those, her husband's obsession with rods and ledgers seemed almost relaxing. They lived a quiet married life. She worked in a loom house. He worked in the market office. In the evenings, they sat together while she tied resist patterns and he updated ledger entries with all the satisfaction of a man who believed numbers were superior to people. His biggest flaw, if we can call it a flaw, was that he occasionally lectured people about dye consistency at social events. He didn't do it maliciously. He just forgot that other humans did not consider VAT pH to be a festive topic. Once, during a naming ceremony, he leaned toward a guest and murmured, "You know, your last cloth commission faded unusually fast. Perhaps the thickeners were diluted." The guest stared at him as if witnessing an omen. His wife discreetly handed him a calabash of palm wine to silence him. Despite this, people respected him. He was predictable, slow-moving in a comforting way. The kind of official who remembered every merchant by their weaving style, who never raised his voice, and who occasionally offered gentle advice like, "Perhaps keep your cloth away from goats. They chew blue." He grew older without changing much. His ledger grew thicker. His shoulders rounded from years of leaning over bamboo slips. His hair grayed into the same faded indigo shade as old dye cloth. He was content. Near the end of his life, he took on an apprentice. A nervous young boy who dropped pens, stumbled over mats, and once mistook a roll of dyed cloth for a seat cushion. Alawawena spent months teaching him the delicate art of looking unimpressed at counterfeit goods. "Your eyebrows," he said, "must express disappointment, not anger. Anger invites argument. Disappointment invites confession." The apprentice took notes. When Alawawena finally retired, slowly, reluctantly, after several nudges from the town chiefs, people genuinely missed him. Markets felt slightly less orderly. Dye houses had fewer quality complaints to laugh about. And occasionally, someone would pick up a cake of indigo and murmur, "Does this one have soul?" The measuring rod he invented continued circulating long after he stopped using it. Some say the town still keeps his original staff in storage somewhere, quietly absorbing dust, still perfectly straight. Alawawena lived his final years sitting outside his house, watching cloth dry on lines that fluttered like calm, waiting breaths. He did not seek legacy. But legacy, in its own small, unworried way, settled around him anyway. Let's drift deeper into the indigo world, gliding slowly into the life of someone whose existence sat right at the crossroads of tradition and trouble. Though the trouble was very, very soft, the bedtime-appropriate kind, more like a persistent inconvenience than anything resembling conflict. Her name was Omisala, and she grew up in one of those weaving compounds where everything seemed to hum with quiet purpose, except for Omisala herself, who hummed mostly with schemes. Small ones. Harmless ones. The kind of schemes that never made history but absolutely made the older aunties sigh loudly into their dye bowls. Omisala was born into a family of patternteers, those expert hands who created resist designs before the cloth ever touched a vat. It was tedious work for most people, but for her, tying knots wasn't just labor. It was entertainment. She treated patterns the way some children treat storytelling, a place where imagination could misbehave gently. Her earliest masterpiece, if the family records can be trusted, was a wrapper cloth she tied at the age of 9. She was supposed to create a simple, geometric resist pattern. Instead, she produced an accidental motif that looked vaguely like a lizard trying to write poetry. Her mother sighed. The dye matriarch sighed. Even the vat seemed to sigh, bubbling a little extra at the edges. But afterward, one aunt later admitted, it was interesting. Which, in Yoruba textile language, meant, it wasn't wrong enough to scold, but it probably won't happen again. Except it did. Omisala was curious in that unhelpful, but ultimately endearing way. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. Questions like, what if we tie the cloth after the first dye bath? What if we use thicker knots? Thinner knots? Upside down knots? What if the cloth doesn't want to be a pattern today? That last one made her grandmother briefly reconsider the concept of apprenticeships. Still, no one discouraged her. Not really, because curiosity has its uses, even when it makes people tired. Through her teenage years, Omisala became known for patterns that confused cloth buyers at first glance, but slowly grew on them, like shy designs deciding whether they wanted attention. Her peers produced clean grids, clean stripes, clean diamonds. Omisala produced shapes that looked faintly like conversations. Her success came oddly early. A wealthy trader passing through the area bought one of her experimental cloths, not because he understood it, but because he assumed that anything confusing must be fashionable in a different town. That was all it took. Suddenly people were whispering, there is a girl in that compound who ties cloth like she lives in the future. Which was not a compliment the aunties were thrilled about. No one wants the future in a dye house. The vats prefer the past. But gossip spreads in Yoruba markets like calm wind, the type that doesn't rush but still gets everywhere. Soon enough, Omisala received more commissions. Some from travelers. Some from local families wanting to seem adventurous. Some from people who simply wanted to say, yes, I own one of her pieces, the same way people later bragged about knowing obscure musicians before they were famous. She didn't let the praise go to her head. She barely noticed it, to be honest. She was too busy experimenting, tying cloth with the focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't necessarily need solving. Her process was slow and rhythmic. She tied knots under the shade trees. She tied knots during market walks. She tied knots while listening to older women tell her stories of the old textile towns. These stories drifted through her mind while she worked. Stories of indigo caravans, of weaving courts, of dye pits so ancient they were treated like respected elders. He drafted proposals, charts, tables, written guidelines gently suggesting that perhaps, just maybe, the town might consider adopting a unified measuring rod. Nothing dramatic, nothing transformative, just consistent lengths that did not require interpretive dance to calculate. People ignored him for 2 years. He kept writing. Eventually, one of the senior town chiefs, exhausted by a particularly confusing trade dispute, said, fine, let him have his rod. And so Alawowena received his greatest joy, a carved, officially sanctioned cloth measuring staff, marked in calm little increments. He carried it everywhere, even when unnecessary. Even at festivals. Even to weddings. His mother once asked, must you bring that to dinner? Yes, he replied. I'm testing humidity effects. He was not testing humidity effects. He just liked holding it. Alawowena's personal life was predictably uneventful. He married a woman named Bamadiel, who was equally calm and equally unbothered by his fixation on measurements. She came from a dyeing family, so she already understood the emotional swings of vat-based economies. Compared to those, her husband's obsession with rods and ledgers seemed almost relaxing. They lived a quiet married life. She worked in a loom house. He worked in the market office. In the evenings, they sat together while she tied resist patterns and he updated ledger entries with all the satisfaction of a man who believed numbers were superior to people. His biggest flaw, if we can call it a flaw, was that he occasionally lectured people about dye consistency at social events. He didn't do it maliciously. He just forgot that other humans did not consider vat pH to be a festive topic. Once, during a naming ceremony, he leaned toward a guest and murmured, you know, your last cloth commission faded unusually fast. Perhaps the thickeners were diluted. The guest stared at him as if witnessing an omen. His wife discreetly handed him a calabash of palm wine to silence him. Despite this, people respected him. He was predictable, slow-moving in a comforting way. The kind of official who remembered every merchant by their weaving style, who never raised his voice, and who occasionally offered gentle advice like, "Perhaps keep your cloth away from goats. They chew blue." He grew older without changing much. His ledger grew thicker. His shoulders rounded from years of leaning over bamboo slips. His hair grayed into the same faded indigo shade as old dye cloth. He was content. Near the end of his life, he took on an apprentice. A nervous young boy who dropped pens, stumbled over mats, and once mistook a roll of dyed cloth for a seat cushion. Alawawena spent months teaching him the delicate art of looking unimpressed at counterfeit goods. "Your eyebrows," he said, "must express disappointment, not anger. Anger invites argument. Disappointment invites confession." The apprentice took notes. When Alawawena finally retired, slowly, reluctantly, after several nudges from the town chiefs, people genuinely missed him. Markets felt slightly less orderly. Dye houses had fewer quality complaints to laugh about. And occasionally, someone would pick up a cake of indigo and murmur, "Does this one have soul?" The measuring rod he invented continued circulating long after he stopped using it. Some say the town still keeps his original staff in storage somewhere, quietly absorbing dust, still perfectly straight. Alawawena lived his final years sitting outside his house, watching cloth dry on lines that fluttered like calm, waiting breaths. He did not seek legacy. But legacy, in its own small, unworried way, settled around him anyway. Let's drift deeper into the indigo world, gliding slowly into the life of someone whose existence sat right at the crossroads of tradition and trouble. Though the trouble was very, very soft, the bedtime-appropriate kind, more like a persistent inconvenience than anything resembling conflict. Her name was Omisala, and she grew up in one of those weaving compounds where everything seemed to hum with quiet purpose, except for Omisala herself, who hummed mostly with schemes. Small ones. Harmless ones. The kind of schemes that never made history but absolutely made the older aunties sigh loudly into their dye bowls. Omisala was born into a family of pattern-tears, those expert hands who created resist designs before the cloth ever touched a vat. It was tedious work for most people, but for her, tying knots wasn't just labor. It was entertainment. She treated patterns the way some children treat storytelling, a place where imagination could misbehave gently. Her earliest masterpiece, if the family records can be trusted, was a wrapper cloth she tied at the age of 9. She was supposed to create a simple, geometric resist pattern. Instead, she produced an accidental motif that looked vaguely like a lizard trying to write poetry. Her mother sighed. The dye matriarch sighed. Even the vat seemed to sigh, bubbling a little extra at the edges. But afterward, one aunt later admitted, it was interesting. Which, in Yoruba textile language, meant, it wasn't wrong enough to scold, but it probably won't happen again. Except it did. Omisala was curious in that unhelpful, but ultimately endearing way. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. Questions like, what if we tie the cloth after the first dye bath? What if we use thicker knots? Thinner knots? Upside-down knots? What if the cloth doesn't want to be a pattern today? That last one made her grandmother briefly reconsider the concept of apprenticeships. Still, no one discouraged her. Not really, because curiosity has its uses, even when it makes people tired. Through her teenage years, Omisala became known for patterns that confused cloth buyers at first glance, but slowly grew on them, like shy designs deciding whether they wanted attention. Her peers produced clean grids, clean stripes, clean diamonds. Omisala produced shapes that looked faintly like conversations. Her success came oddly early. A wealthy trader passing through the area bought one of her experimental cloths, not because he understood it, but because he assumed that anything confusing must be fashionable in a different town. That was all it took. Suddenly people were whispering, there is a girl in that compound who ties cloth like she lives in the future. Which was not a compliment the aunties were thrilled about. No one wants the future in a dye house. the vats prefer the past. But gossip spreads in Yoruba markets like calm wind, the type that doesn't rush but still gets everywhere. Soon enough, Omisala received more commissions. Some from travelers. Some from local families wanting to seem adventurous. Some from people who simply wanted to say, "Yes, I own one of her pieces," the same way people later bragged about knowing obscure musicians before they were famous. She didn't let the praise go to her head. She barely noticed it, to be honest. She was too busy experimenting, tying cloth with the focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't necessarily need solving. Her process was slow and rhythmic. She tied knots under the shade trees. She tied knots during market walks. She tied knots while listening to older women tell her stories of the old textile towns. These stories drifted through her mind while she worked. Stories of indigo caravans, of weaving courts, of dye pits so ancient they were treated like respected elders. Now, in this chapter, we're going to discuss something that sounds, at first, so boring, so monumentally anticlimactic, that it loops back around and becomes strangely fascinating. The Nubian potter's relationship with time. Not the mystical Einstein kind. Not even the time travel, sci-fi. Let's go back and prevent amphora-related tragedies kind. Just normal time. Waiting. Seasons. Calendars that weren't really calendars so much as vibes plus star observations. Because pottery, as it turns out, is basically 90% waiting and 10% intense panic that your clay is cracking. Gentle beginnings, the clay that refused to be rushed. Picture an ancient Nubian potter, let's call him Tariq for convenience, sitting beside the riverbank. He's working a lump of clay with the energy of someone kneading dough, slowly, sleepily, occasionally sighing like the weight of the entire Nile flood cycle is on his shoulders. Tariq knows one thing for certain. You cannot rush clay. You can try. You can glare at it. You can mutter at it. You can poke it and pretend you're checking moisture levels. But clay simply does not care. It will dry when it wants to dry, and not 1 second sooner. So Nubian potters learned an early, time-honored lesson in patience. The kind of patience modern humans never experience unless they're waiting for hotel Wi-Fi to load or for a 99% completed file to move to 100%, which it will not do until you've already spiritually given up. The desert clock, sunlight as a slow-motion hourglass. Most cultures develop clocks of some kind. Not Nubian potters. They already had the ultimate chronometer. The sun. Not a sundial. Not calibrated sticks. Just the sun. Because pottery drying wasn't about exact minutes or hours. It was about whether the morning breeze had already chased the dew away, or whether the afternoon heat was about to turn everything into desert jerky. Potters became experts in squinting at the sky, making educated guesses, announcing, "Not yet," at least 6 times a day. Honestly, they could have written a whole book titled, Drying Clay, a treatise on doing absolutely nothing for hours at a time. Star schedules, when the night sky was your notification system. You know how modern people check their phones every 5 minutes? Nubian potters checked the sky. Not to see if they got messages, unless you count constellations sending celestial, "please wait," notifications, but because they knew that certain stars rising meant the winds would shift, the nights would get colder, the clay would dry slower or faster, the yearly kiln firing window was approaching, or in short, the universe itself was their production calendar. Imagine working in a system where your boss is the Andromeda constellation. Very motivational. Zero micromanagement. Kiln timing. The one moment when everyone suddenly had opinions. Most of pottery work was slow. Meditative. But firing day? Chaos. Absolute, nonsensical, well-coordinated chaos. Kilns in Nubia didn't operate year-round. Fuel had to be collected, winds had to be right, humidity had to be tolerable, and everyone involved needed to avoid the curse of, "My pot exploded inside the kiln, so now we all suffer." Thus, kiln firing day was the ancient equivalent of a big project launch. Except instead of sending emails, people ran around yelling things like, "More dung! More dung! Who opened the vent? I just closed the vent. Someone tell Amon to stop tapping the pots like he's testing melons." It was the busiest slow process you could imagine, because once the fire started, everything slowed down again. Kilns were not microwaves. They were more like ancient slow cookers set to a heat level called, "Hope this works." Potters sat, waited, watched, and occasionally poked things. But mostly waited. Waiting was the true national sport. The rhythm of seasons. Why every pot was a miniature calendar. Here's a fascinatingly sleepy idea. Every pot was a timestamp. Clay collected during rainy season behaved differently. Clay collected during hot months cracked in new and exciting ways. Clay shaped during harvest season might have flecks of straw mixed into it. So you could literally pick up a pot, look at its texture, its firing color, the fine patterns in the clay body, and say, well, yes, clearly this was from the late dry season locust breeze period. Obviously. Nubian potters probably didn't say this with that level of smug expertise, but archaeologists today absolutely do. And they love it, possibly too much. The art of doing nothing productively. The biggest secret of Nubian pottery wasn't their kiln structure. It wasn't their clay recipe. It wasn't even their masterful cooling techniques. It was their profoundly refined ability to wait without losing their minds. Modern society has lost this skill entirely. Ask someone today to sit quietly for 1 hour with no devices, no tasks, and no distractions, and they will immediately start reorganizing furniture in their mind or remembering embarrassing moments from 7th grade. Nubian potters? They were chill. So chill they could probably win gold medals in stillness if it were an Olympic sport. Their waiting time wasn't empty time. It was social time, storytelling time, sharpening tools time, drinking something mildly questionable from clay cups time, poking the clay again even though they knew better time. The point is, they moved to the same slow, patient rhythm as the Nile itself. The psychological philosophy of the kiln. Potters believed in the kiln almost like a living being. Not literally, no one thought the kiln was going to get up and walk away, but they treated it with ritual consistency, respect, malfear, the general attitude people reserve for antique printers that only work if you whisper compliments at them. The kiln wasn't a machine. It wasn't even a tool. It was a process. And processes have personalities. Some kilns liked higher heat. Some cracked pots more often. Some produced rich red tones while others insisted on giving everything a weird greenish tint. Potters remembered these quirks the way modern people remember which USB port actually works on their laptop. Nubian timekeeping, a philosophy, not a schedule. And this brings us to the heart of Chapter 7. For Nubian potters, time was not something to control. It wasn't something you fought against. It wasn't something you managed with spreadsheets or alarms. It was simply flow, the cycle, the pattern, a slow and steady background rhythm written into the earth, sky, wind, and clay. Pottery wasn't just a craft. It was a practice in living with the world instead of pushing against it. A lesson modern humans could probably use, considering half of us panic when a web page takes 0.4 seconds longer than expected to load. Let's float gently onward, moving from the slow, waiting world of Nubian kilns back toward the rhythm of Yoruba loom houses. Not because we need drama, excitement, or even narrative tension. Those things would disrupt the calm, but because the soft pulse of everyday work, the quiet repetition of craft, deserves its own slow narration. This chapter is about people whose lives were measured in threads, in vats, and in the gentle turning of clay wheels. People who never made history in bold strokes but whose existence quietly shaped the fabric of daily life. One such figure was Adizwa, a master patternteer whose reputation for patience bordered on legendary. Not for grand displays or market fame, but because she could spend an entire day tying a single strip of cloth and emerge at the end not frustrated, not tired, but with an almost imperceptible sense of calm triumph. That calm was magnetic. Apprentices and younger weavers often found themselves drawn toward her work table, even if they didn't speak. Simply observing her slow, rhythmic hands offered an unexpected lesson in focus. Adizwa's childhood had been unremarkable in the grand chronicles of royalty or trade, but that was exactly the point. She grew up in a compound where everyone worked, but no one raced. Children learned by shadowing elders. Questions were encouraged, but impatience was gently corrected. If a young girl tied a knot too tightly or too loosely, the response was never anger. Just a quiet demonstration, repeated until the hands remembered. This approach shaped Adizwa profoundly. She became someone who could perceive small variations in pattern tension, in dye absorption, in the subtle differences between cotton fibers from neighboring farms. It was a kind of hyper-slow, hyper-focused perception. Not genius in the classical sense, just extremely tuned observation. The kind of skill that allows someone to live a long, steady life without unnecessary surprises. As a teenager, she began taking on commissions. These were rarely grand. Local families, sometimes traveling merchants, occasionally festivals. But each piece was a mini lesson in the flow of work. She learned how to pace herself according to the sun, to the humidity, to the moods of her apprentices, and to the whisper of the wind over drying cloth. The world moved around her, but she moved within it on her own gentle cadence. Her apprentices often remarked on her soft, patient corrections. If someone's cloth slipped in the vat or their knots were uneven, she would touch the fabric lightly, almost ceremonially, and demonstrate again. Sometimes she would hum. Not loudly, not tunefully, just a gentle, barely perceptible vibration of breath that seemed to help the cloth accept its intended shape. And it worked. Over time, her apprentices learned the subtle language of rhythm. They understood that patience was not waiting idly but moving deliberately with intent. Every fold, every knot, every dip in indigo was a conversation with materials that demanded respect, attention, and measured care. Adizwa's life was not without personal trials, though even her challenges unfolded in slow motion. Her younger brother, ambitious and restless, often tried to rush projects, ignoring the careful rhythms she insisted upon. Frustration occasionally simmered, but rather than confront him sharply, she allowed him to witness the outcomes of impatience firsthand: uneven patterns, warped cloth, slightly spoiled dye. Consequences unfolded naturally, in the same measured pace as the world itself. Later, when she married a quiet man who worked in a neighboring loom house, their life together mirrored her professional philosophy. They did not speak loudly, did not argue dramatically, did not rush. Their shared existence was a series of small, comforting patterns. Mornings spent tending vats, afternoons in the shade weaving, evenings watching apprentices, nights counting stars, or the slow passage of wind across drying cloth. Their partnership was unremarkable, and precisely for that reason, it was perfect. Even as she aged, Adizwa never stopped observing. Her hands slowed, but her mind remained attuned to tiny variations. The faintest shift in fiber texture, the barely noticeable color change in fermented indigo, the subtle tilt of a loom's frame. She became a living repository of craft knowledge, not in loud, recorded manuals, but in gestures, demonstrations, and the soft-spoken guidance she gave to the next generation. And so her life continued, quietly, rhythmically. The loom and the vat dictated the day. Apprentices came and went. Patterns emerged, faded, and were remembered only in memory or in the threads passed to other hands. She rarely left her compound, rarely sought recognition, and never needed it. Her legacy was in the calm, steady pulse of craft itself, a slow heartbeat that persisted through the movements of generations, through the passage of the sun and the phases of the moon, in the humble weave of every cloth she touched. Even in death, her influence lingered. Apprentices who had once struggled to tie simple patterns now moved with the same deliberate patience she had modeled. Local markets continued to benefit from the subtly improved quality of cloth. And the rhythm of Yoruba loom houses, which had always moved at the pace of breath and patience, remained steady, as if her hands had never left the fabric at all. And now, as we slowly float away from Adizwa's compound, we can carry with us the calm lesson of her life. That greatness does not always roar, that influence does not require drama, and that the slow, measured attention to small, daily tasks can ripple through generations in ways both quiet and profound. From here, we will drift toward another artisan, one whose work with both cloth and ceremonial dye connects the intimate pace of daily life with the broader, unhurried rhythm of social and cosmic order. The soft hum of practice continues, the looms and vats waiting patiently for hands that know how to move slowly enough to listen. As we continue floating through this gentle world of indigo and loom houses, let's shift our focus slightly from everyday craft to ceremonial practice, though only just. This is not about pageantry, grandeur, or dramatic displays. This is about the slow, quiet way cloth itself carries meaning, authority, and continuity in Yoruba communities, and the subtle human lives that shape and sustain it. Our central figure here is Ifedeo, a woman who lived in the late 18th century and became known, quietly, as a ritual cloth artisan. Not a priestess, not a queen, not someone who commanded attention with words. She commanded attention by touch, by selecting fibers, by layering dye, by folding and tying and pressing cloth until it absorbed not just color, but intention. Ifedeo grew up in a compound much like the others we visited, slow, steady, filled with the low hum of repetitive labor. Children ran and laughed, but she spent much of her early life observing. Her curiosity wasn't loud, it was soft, careful, like listening to a river before trying to cross it. She watched her mother and aunts prepare cloth for special occasions, births, funerals, naming ceremonies, and seasonal festivals, and gradually absorbed their knowledge not by formal instruction, but by osmosis. From the start, she was drawn to the subtle variations in cloth preparation. She noticed how ceremonial cloth required a different rhythm than market cloth. Not necessarily tighter or looser, not necessarily deeper blue or lighter. It required a kind of emotional calibration, careful folding, precise tying, and an awareness of how the cloth would interact with ritual spaces. Ifedeo learned that these differences were meaningful, that a cloth could feel right or feel off even before it was worn. As a teenager, she began assisting in the preparation of festival cloths. These were not large or lavish. They were pieces meant to support communal rituals, for wrapping sacred objects, marking ceremonial boundaries, or subtly signaling social hierarchy. Ifedeo's first task was tying small strips for the elders' processional cloths. She was instructed not to rush, not because the cloth needed careful tying for durability, but because the process itself was part of the ritual. In Yoruba thought, the act of creation, repetition, and patience imbued the cloth with its ceremonial potency. Over time, Ifedeo became highly regarded for her ability to read cloth. Not literally, of course. She didn't whisper to it or consult oracles. But she had a quiet instinct. The texture of the cotton, the saturation of indigo, the tightness of knots, the subtle folds, these things told her whether a cloth would function as intended in ritual. A slightly misaligned fold could disrupt the rhythm of a ceremony, so she treated every preparation as a meditative act. Her personal life was unremarkable, which suited her well. She never married, not out of rebellion, but because she preferred to dedicate her time to practice. Companionship came through apprentices, neighbors, and the quiet presence of cloth waiting to be tied and dyed. She lived in the same compound for decades, her days a slow repetition of steps, selecting fibers, preparing dye, tying patterns, observing drying cloth, and occasionally adjusting for the whims of the environment. There were minor irritations, of course. Fellow artisans sometimes tried to copy her methods. Some elders grumbled that she spent too long perfecting ceremonial cloth. Markets offered commissions she refused, sensing that commercial pressure could destabilize the subtle balance she maintained. But these disturbances were brief, easily absorbed into the rhythm of daily work. Ifedeo was patient. She had learned that small disturbances do not disrupt long processes if the hands and mind remain steady. One of her most delicate projects involved a set of cloths for a midwinter festival. Each piece was small, roughly 1 meter square, dyed in nuanced shades of indigo, and folded with an unusual precision. She spent 3 weeks layering and tying before the first cloth even touched the vat. The apprentices were frustrated. The elders were skeptical. And the clay pots holding the dye? They waited, as always, patient and unbothered. When the cloths were finally unveiled during the ceremony, no one remarked on her skill. No one even asked her name. That was not the point. The cloth itself fulfilled its purpose. Its structured movement, marked hierarchy, and subtly guided ritual action. Ifideo quietly observed, nodded once, and returned to the compound. She knew that her work was effective without applause, and that realization itself was soothing. Her later years were devoted entirely to mentoring apprentices. She passed on technical skills, yes, but also the philosophy of slow, deliberate craft. Young girls and boys who studied with her learned to tie knots not merely to hold dye in place, but to honor a quiet tradition of care, patience, and unassuming precision. Even the tiniest movements mattered. Even small lapses in rhythm had consequences. But these were lessons taught gently, slowly, with a touch that felt like the softest breath on cloth. Ifideo's final act of mentorship was to prepare a set of ceremonial cloths for a festival that would occur long after her death. She tied them, layered them, inspected each one carefully, and then passed them to her apprentices. Her work remained intact, functional, meaningful. And she did not linger, did not announce herself, did not seek recognition. She simply stepped away, letting her life's quiet rhythm ripple forward through those who remained. The lesson of Ifideo's life is subtle. Greatness is not always visible. Influence does not require spectacle. A life can be meaningful without drama, impact without fanfare. In the unhurried movements of hands and the measured care of everyday practice, a profound kind of legacy emerges. From here, we will drift even further, toward more artisans whose lives revolved around rhythm, patience, and quiet mastery. The soft pulse of craft continues, unbroken as the loom, the vat, and the kiln wait for hands that have learned to move slowly enough to listen. As we continue our slow drift through Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, let's pause to consider the matriarchs, the women who quietly orchestrated daily life, craft, and ritual in ways so subtle that history almost forgot them. Not queens, not famous merchants, not travelers whose names appear in dusty chronicles. Just calm, patient, steady women whose lives wove the invisible threads holding communities together. Our focus here is on Yijide, a matriarch whose calm authority shaped a compound for nearly half a century. She was not loud. She did not raise her voice, even when apprentices tied knots incorrectly for the third or fourth time that morning. Her power came from rhythm, observation, and consistency. If you entered her compound expecting drama, you would be disappointed. But if you entered expecting structure, subtle guidance, and a slow, reassuring sense of order, you would understand her influence immediately. Yijide's childhood was typical of women in her community. Long days beside her mother, tying resist patterns, watching vats, carrying water, and learning to distinguish quality fibers from inferior ones. She was not exceptional at first glance. She did not create dazzling patterns that traveled to distant markets. But she absorbed the lessons around her. Every fold, every knot, every decision about the timing of a dye bath left a quiet imprint on her mind. By the time she married and took over a household, Yijide had developed a remarkable capacity for timing. She knew exactly when to instruct apprentices, when to allow them to make mistakes, and when to intervene. This timing was not rigid. It was responsive, flexible, attuned to human temperament as much as to the behavior of cloth and clay. Her compound functioned like a slow-moving machine, each part lubricated by patience. Looms clicked, vats fermented, clay rested. Children played quietly under the shade, apprentices moved through their duties in predictable sequences, and the women she supervised executed complex craft routines without needing constant supervision. Yijide's presence was subtle, sometimes a glance, sometimes a gentle touch, but it shaped the flow of work entirely. Even in small domestic rituals, she exerted influence. Meals were prepared with attention to rhythm and timing, water drawn before the sun was high enough to overheat the compound, grains husked in intervals to match the pace of other chores, dye pots stirred just enough to maintain consistency without disturbing their delicate equilibrium. Every act was both practical and meditative. Her attention to detail extended to ceremonial preparation as well. For festival cloths, she oversaw the layering, tying, and dyeing process, ensuring that every piece would fulfill its intended function, not flashy or dramatic, just correct and harmonious. She did not need to intervene with words often. Her apprentices learned to anticipate her expectations. Mistakes were gently corrected, lessons embedded in touch, timing, and observation rather than rebuke. Yijide's personal life reflected the same calm consistency. Her marriage was quiet, companionable. Her husband, a moderately skilled dyer, respected her judgment and deferred to her experience in both household management and craft. They had children, some of whom followed her into weaving and dyeing, while others pursued less structured trades. She guided them all, not by force, but by modeling patience and deliberate care. As the years passed, Yijide became a living archive of compound knowledge. Apprentices came to rely on her memory of previous dye batches, cloth dimensions, and even subtler cues, the slight shift in sunlight that would affect drying times, or the subtle humidity that might influence the firmness of a knot. She never boasted of this knowledge. She simply applied it day after day, slowly, deliberately. Her greatest legacy was not in records, nor in fame, nor in any single remarkable object. It was in the smooth, predictable rhythm of the compound she maintained. Looms and vats operated at a gentle, steady pace. Apprentices learned discipline without harsh correction. Ceremonial cloths were always ready on time, folded precisely, and imbued with quiet intention. Even her passing reflected this rhythm. She did not fall suddenly. She did not vanish dramatically. She slowed, gradually transferring responsibility to her most trusted apprentices and children, ensuring that the compound continued to function seamlessly after her departure. And when she died, the household absorbed the loss with a measured calm. The rhythm continued. Looms clicked. Vats fermented. Clay rested. Yijide's life reminds us that history is not always shaped by kings or battles or dramatic events. Sometimes it is shaped by quiet persistence, slow attention, and the patient structuring of everyday life. And in the context of Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, that kind of influence, though understated, was essential. As we float further into the soft rhythm of Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, it is time to turn our attention to apprentices, those young, often awkward hands who learn to move slowly, deliberately, and almost imperceptibly under the guidance of masters like Adizwa, Ifedeo, and Yijide. Not because they were dramatic or extraordinary, but because their quiet transformation over years of patient instruction tells us a lot about how knowledge, rhythm, and craft were preserved. Our central figure in this chapter is Babatunde, a boy whose life began with curiosity and clumsiness in equal measure. From the moment he first stepped into a loom house, he exhibited all the predictable signs of a novice: too tight knots, uneven strips of cloth, a tendency to spill dye, and a nervous habit of hurrying through every task. In a different world, his impatience might have earned scolding. Here, it earned careful observation. Babatunde's early days were marked by slow correction. His master, a calm woman named Alyawafink, would let him tie a section of cloth incorrectly, observe the consequences, and then guide him back to the proper technique. Not with shouting, not with punishment, simply with quiet demonstration, sometimes accompanied by gentle murmurs. See how the thread sags? The cloth will absorb the dye unevenly. Try again. He would attempt it again. Observe. Adjust. And gradually, the repetition embedded itself, not in fear, but in understanding. Over months and years, his mistakes became fewer, his knots tighter, his folding straighter. He moved from chaotic motion to measured, rhythmic movement, a physical reflection of patience itself. Apprentices like Babatunde also learned the timing of craft. In loom houses, a single misstep could ripple through an entire day's work. A knot tied too early, a cloth dipped too soon, a pattern pulled at the wrong moment. These small miscalculations reminded him that craft was as much about waiting as doing. The rhythm of observation, anticipation, and execution became his silent teacher. Over time, Babatunde became a bridge between generations. He absorbed the practices of the older artisans and began to notice subtleties they themselves had almost forgotten. The way humidity subtly altered the pace of drying cloth. The faint color shift that predicted an imperfect dye bath. The gentle sway of the loom that dictated knot tension. These were things only noticeable after years of slow attention, and he recorded them, not on paper, but in his hands, his rhythm, and his memory. His adolescence was unremarkable to outsiders, but deeply formative in the quiet world of the loom house. While other children played and ran freely, Babatunde learned the endurance of stillness, the patience to watch, the discipline to repeat, and the calm acceptance of slow progress. His hands remembered lessons his mind sometimes forgot. His fingers could anticipate the next fold, the next dip, the next rhythm of drying without conscious thought. As he matured, Babatunde began teaching younger apprentices, repeating the same gentle methods that had guided him. Mistakes were tolerated as part of learning. Hurrying was corrected not with anger, but with a subtle demonstration of the correct pace. And the cycle continued. Knowledge passed quietly, slowly, imperceptibly, weaving itself into the very texture of daily life. Interestingly, Babatunde's personal life mirrored his apprenticeship. He never sought attention. He never married hastily or pursued dramatic ambition. Instead, he built a life of calm consistency. He continued to work in the compound, moved through festivals and ceremonial cloth preparations with quiet focus, and maintained relationships that were slow, deliberate, and enduring. The rhythm of craft structured his existence, and he became, in his unassuming way, a stabilizing presence for the entire compound. By his 40s, Babatunde had become indispensable, not for his brilliance, nor for any dramatic innovations, but for the reliability of his measured attention. Looms moved smoothly under his hands. Dye vats were handled with care. Apprentices absorbed lessons without undue stress. Ceremonial cloths emerged consistent, harmonious, and ready on schedule. His life was a testament to the power of quiet persistence, showing how the patient repetition of small actions sustains both craft and culture. Even in old age, Babatunde did not rush. He continued to observe, correct gently, and move with unhurried hands. His legacy was not recorded in grand monuments, nor inscribed in formal documents. It lived in the rhythm of the loom, the careful folds of ceremonial cloth, and the steady pulse of apprentices who had learned, slowly but surely, to move in step with generations that came before them. And so, as we drift away from Babatunde's compound, the lesson is clear. The quiet persistence of apprentices is the unseen force that sustains tradition, the soft heartbeat of craft that keeps rhythms alive through decades, centuries, and beyond. In this gentle world, every small action matters, every repetition counts, and every patient hand contributes to the calm continuity of life. As we continue our slow drift through Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, we arrive at the quiet intersection of craft, family, and trade. Not the dramatic, world-changing trade routes filled with shouting merchants and storm-tossed caravans. No, here we are concerned with the gentle ebb and flow of everyday commerce, the kind that shaped communities through patience, repetition, and subtle social negotiation. Our focus is Morinkeji, a woman whose life spanned both household labor and modest market trade. She was not wealthy, nor was she celebrated far beyond her village. Yet her existence demonstrates how carefully woven routines and small social networks maintained continuity and cohesion in daily life. Morinkeji's day began like any other in a loom house compound. The low clack of looms, the hum of apprentices, the distant trickle of water from nearby streams. She selected fibers, checked for quality, prepared dye vats, and tied intricate patterns with care. All of this, in itself, might seem ordinary, but she had an added layer of responsibility. She coordinated small-scale trade with neighboring compounds and local markets. The rhythm of this trade was slow and deliberate. Merchants from nearby towns would arrive mid-morning, carrying baskets of cloth, beads, or raw fibers. They did not arrive hurriedly, nor did they haggle aggressively. Instead, they moved according to the same patient cadence that guided Morinkeji's household. Agreements were made quietly, exchanges took time, and negotiations were more like gentle suggestions than confrontations. Morinkeji's family life mirrored the same measured approach. Her husband, a quiet dyer, contributed to daily labor, and their children assisted in weaving, dyeing, and preparation for market trips. Tasks were divided carefully, with consideration for skill, stamina, and temperament. Everyone learned to move at the pace the materials dictated rather than forcing haste. Mistakes were corrected gently, and patience was the prevailing ethic. Interestingly, Morinkeji's role in trade often required subtle observation rather than direct action. She would watch visiting traders carefully, noting which buyers returned frequently, which apprentices performed best under pressure, and which cloth patterns sold more easily without explanation. These observations informed her instructions to family members and apprentices, ensuring that the household maintained a consistent standard of quality and reliability. Seasonal rhythms also played a significant role. Cloth produced during rainy months absorbed dye differently than cloth produced in dry months. Vats fermented at varying rates depending on temperature, and humidity influenced drying times. Morinkeji had learned to anticipate these variations and schedule both production and trade accordingly. She could predict, with surprising accuracy, when a batch of cloth would be ready for sale or ceremonial use. Her calm presence extended to social interactions as well. Village elders, neighboring matriarchs, and visiting traders all recognized her quiet authority. Not because she spoke loudly, but because she acted with consistent competence. Her decisions were deliberate, measured, and rarely questioned. Apprentices and family members learned to trust her judgment simply by observing her day-to-day approach to work and negotiation. Morinkeji's life also highlights the subtle interplay between innovation and tradition. She occasionally experimented with slight variations in pattern or dye technique, but only after careful observation and consultation with trusted elders. These small innovations were absorbed slowly into household routines and market expectations, never disruptive, always deliberate. In this way, continuity and adaptation coexisted gently, maintaining both stability and flexibility. By her later years, Morinkeji's compound was a model of rhythm and reliability. Looms moved in quiet harmony. Apprentices followed instructions without urgent reminders. Dye vats were tended with patient attention. Cloth prepared for ceremonial use retained subtle consistency that was only noticeable to those who understood the craft deeply. Trade continued at a measured pace, and family routines remained harmonious, guided by her steady influence. Her legacy was not written in records or monuments. It was recorded in the rhythm of the compound, the skill of her apprentices, and the trust of those who conducted trade with her family. She exemplified the idea that history is often shaped not by dramatic events, but by steady, patient stewardship of daily life. As we leave Morinkeji's compound and drift toward the next story, the lesson is clear. In these quiet, disciplined communities, the pulse of craft, family, and trade moves at a tempo dictated by observation, patience, and subtle guidance. There is no rush. There is no spectacle. Only continuity, care, and the gentle flow of life. As we continue drifting gently through the rhythms of Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, we now turn to the softly orchestrated world of communal festivals. These are not grand spectacles designed to awe outsiders, nor dramatic celebrations recorded in chronicles. Instead, they unfold in measured preparation, patient coordination, and subtle attention to timing, a natural extension of daily craft and household rhythm. Our focus here is Alaba, a woman responsible for coordinating ceremonial cloth for several neighboring compounds. Her life demonstrates how ritual, craft, and patience intertwine. She did not lead rituals herself, nor was she called a priestess, but her hands and careful planning determined how the festivals would look, feel, and proceed. Alaba began her day like any other artisan, the soft click of loom shuttles, the distant hum of fermenting indigo vats, and the muted laughter of children in the compound. Her work for festivals, however, introduced a new dimension: timing and alignment. Certain cloths had to be prepared in exact sequences, tied and dyed to meet the slow unfolding of ceremonial events. If cloth dried too early or too late, subtle disruptions in ritual flow could occur. Preparation for festivals was a multi-week process. First, fibers had to be selected carefully. Those intended for ceremonial purposes were often slightly finer, softer, and more pliable than standard market cloth. The folding and tying process demanded exactitude. Every strip had to follow traditional motifs, yet slight variations were allowed to reflect the natural creativity of the artisan. This balance between tradition and subtle innovation was Aliba's specialty. Next came the dyeing process. Indigo vats were temperamental. Seasonal shifts, humidity, and even faint breezes influenced how cloth absorbed color. Aliba spent hours observing vats, adjusting immersion times by intuition rather than schedule, ensuring that ceremonial cloth achieved the desired richness without oversaturation. She often instructed apprentices with quiet gestures rather than loud commands, her hands demonstrating the correct pace, the subtle angle, the pressure needed to produce consistent results. Once the cloth dried, folding and transport were equally deliberate. Aliba trained apprentices to handle ceremonial cloth with care, to move slowly, to stack evenly, and to respect both the material and the symbolic intention behind it. She reinforced the philosophy that the act of preparation was itself part of the ritual. Every careful knot, every layer of dye, every fold reinforced the cultural memory embedded in the cloth. The festivals themselves were calm, measured events. Participants moved deliberately, matching the rhythm established by the artisan's preparation. Ceremonial cloth guided procession paths, indicated social roles, and subtly structured interaction, all without fanfare or attention-seeking displays. Outsiders might have overlooked these details, but within the community, the effect was profound: order, beauty, and quiet cohesion. Aliba's influence extended beyond the immediate festival cycle. She trained apprentices who then replicated her methods across other compounds, spreading a philosophy of patient preparation and meticulous attention. She encouraged observation and slow learning, emphasizing that rushing any stage, fiber selection, tying, dyeing, or folding, could compromise both aesthetic quality and ceremonial meaning. Even her personal life mirrored the same calm rhythm. She did not pursue grand ambitions or public recognition. She maintained her own household quietly, balancing work, mentorship, and family obligations. Relationships unfolded naturally and slowly, aligned with the pace dictated by daily responsibilities and seasonal cycles. Through her decades of practice, Aliba exemplified the principle that ritual life is sustained not by spectacle but by subtle, disciplined preparation. Her influence was visible only in the smooth flow of ceremonial events, the consistent quality of ceremonial cloth, and the apprentice hands she guided. It was the soft pulse beneath the visible ceremony, unnoticed by most, yet indispensable to the community. By the end of her life, Aliba had mentored numerous apprentices, coordinated countless ceremonial cloth cycles, and ensured that festivals continued uninterrupted for generations. Her work was not recorded in texts or monuments. Instead, it lived in the hands of those who tied, dyed, and folded, and in the slow, deliberate rhythm of community life itself. As we leave Aliba's compound, we carry forward the lesson of this chapter. Ritual, craft, and patience are inseparable. In the quiet, measured preparation of ceremonial cloth, communities sustain tradition, nurture apprentices, and maintain the continuity of cultural memory. The pulse of daily life and festival preparation remains steady, gentle, and enduring. We continue our slow exploration of Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, turning now to the intersection of apprenticeship, family life, and the subtle transmission of knowledge. This chapter focuses not on dramatic events or famous names, but on the quiet continuity created when generations learn, observe, and act at a gentle, measured pace. At the heart of this story is Alyamide, a young apprentice whose life illustrates the rhythms of learning in a compound governed by patience. He was the youngest of 4 siblings, all of whom were familiar with the basic tasks of weaving and dyeing. From an early age, Alyamide watched his mother, a skilled artisan, perform her work with deliberate calm. He absorbed lessons not through lectures, but by observation, imitation, and gentle correction. Apprentices like Alyamide learned the subtle art of timing. They discovered that dye absorption depended on ambient humidity, that fibers behaved differently at various times of the day, and that the folding of cloth was a slow dialogue between material and hand. Mistakes were expected and gently corrected. Each failure was not a setback but a teaching moment, reinforcing the principle that patience and repetition yield mastery. Olyamide's family played an essential role in shaping this rhythm. His older siblings, having already absorbed years of instruction, acted as intermediate guides, bridging the gap between the experienced matriarchs and the youngest apprentices. The household itself became a living, breathing school where work, learning, and care were intertwined. Meals were timed to align with loom schedules, water for dye vats was drawn in measured intervals, and quiet observation of tasks was encouraged at every stage. As Olyamide matured, he began to notice subtler lessons: the social rhythm of the compound, the gentle negotiation required in small trades, and the importance of consistent, unobtrusive guidance. Elders like his mother or grandmother rarely imposed strict rules. Instead, they relied on subtle demonstration: a hand adjusting a knot, a gentle rearrangement of folded cloth, or a quiet nod of approval. Through these gestures, apprentices internalized not only technique but the philosophy of careful, deliberate action. Family structures also reinforced continuity. Knowledge was passed slowly, generation to generation, within the intimate context of household life. Ritual and ceremonial work, market trade, and daily chores were all intertwined, teaching apprentices like Olyamide that craft was inseparable from social responsibility and communal harmony. The pace of life in the compound, guided by matriarchs and experienced artisans, shaped character as much as skill. Olyamide eventually became competent in the technical aspects of weaving and dyeing, but his true growth lay in developing an instinct for timing, rhythm, and observation. He learned to anticipate problems in dye absorption, recognize the subtle differences between fibers, and adjust his handling of cloth to maintain ceremonial and aesthetic consistency. His hands moved with a confidence that came not from rushing, but from years of patient attention and repeated, gentle practice. By adulthood, Olyamide embodied the philosophy of his household: a life of measured attention, quiet persistence, and respect for the slow processes of craft and social interaction. His work, like that of countless apprentices before him, reinforced the rhythm of community life, ensuring that ceremonial cloth, market textiles, and daily weaving maintained both quality and continuity. Even when overseeing his own apprentices, Olyamide continued the gentle methods he had learned. Mistakes were opportunities for quiet correction. Tasks were paced according to observation rather than urgency. Knowledge was transmitted through action, patience, and subtle guidance, creating a chain of continuity that spanned generations. As we continue drifting gently through Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, Chapter 15 turns our attention to the seasonal cycles that shaped craft, household life, and community cohesion. Here, time is measured not in hours or minutes, but in sun, wind, and rain, the natural pulse that guides both people and materials. Our central figure in this chapter is Adebayo, a man whose role as a master dyer required him to understand the subtle interactions between weather, water, and fiber. Unlike the apprentices we have met, who learned the slow rhythm of craft primarily from observation, Adebayo's life was structured by the natural calendar. Each year brought predictable challenges and opportunities, and he learned to align his work with them patiently. During the rainy season, moisture in the air slowed the drying of cloth, requiring careful attention to hanging and spacing in the compound. Fibers swelled differently, affecting both pattern precision and dye absorption. Adebayo adjusted his processes incrementally: slightly longer immersion times in indigo vats, careful folding, and frequent inspection. He moved deliberately, aware that rushing would compromise quality. The apprentices observed silently, absorbing lessons in timing, patience, and responsiveness. Conversely, the dry season introduced new considerations. Cloth dried faster, and vats behaved differently due to evaporation. Dust and wind occasionally disrupted delicate patterns. Adebayo's hands, experienced from years of working with seasonal variation, compensated for these effects instinctively. He guided apprentices gently, demonstrating how to respond to environmental changes without panic or complaint. Seasonal rhythms also influenced ceremonial preparation. Festivals, naming ceremonies, and other communal events were planned in accordance with the cycles of the year. Cloth intended for ritual use needed to be ready at the precise moment dictated by the solar and lunar calendar, which dictated both timing and ceremonial appropriateness. Adebayo coordinated these preparations with quiet authority, ensuring that ceremonial cloth was consistently ready on schedule. Family life, too, was shaped by seasons. Daily chores, food preparation, and household maintenance were paced according to environmental conditions. Water was collected when it was most accessible, children assisted more during slower periods, and elders directed apprentices to tasks aligned with the natural flow of the day. Craft, trade, and domestic life were inseparably linked to the slow rhythms of the environment. Adebayo also understood the psychological benefits of this alignment. Work conducted according to natural rhythm created a calm, predictable environment, reducing stress and fostering patience. Apprentices learned to observe changes in light, temperature, and humidity, translating these observations into deliberate, careful action. Over time, these small lessons reinforced a philosophy of attention, care, and measured response, which extended far beyond craft. Even the smallest details mattered. Slight shifts in wind could influence drying times. Minor variations in water source affected indigo concentration. Subtle changes in sunlight dictated the placement of cloth on drying racks. Each factor required patient observation and adjustment. Through this slow, meticulous attention, Adebayo maintained both quality and consistency, ensuring that his compound operated with quiet reliability year after year. By the end of his life, Adebayo had mentored generations of apprentices who internalized these seasonal rhythms. They learned not only technical skill, but also how to live in harmony with time and environment, how to pace themselves, and how to observe subtle cues in both material and social worlds. His legacy was the preservation of knowledge embedded in daily, unhurried practice. As we leave Adebayo's compound, the lesson of this chapter is clear. Craft and life are inseparable from the rhythms of nature. Seasons dictate timing, patience ensures quality, and attention to subtle environmental cues shapes both skill and social harmony. In these communities, slow observation and responsiveness are as important as any tool, loom, or dye vat. As we continue our gentle journey through Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, Chapter 16 focuses on the interconnectedness of craft, family, and ceremonial life. This is a world where the pace of daily work, the rhythm of apprenticeships, and the timing of festivals all flow together in quiet harmony. Nothing dramatic occurs. There are no battles, no sudden disasters. Instead, life unfolds slowly, deliberately, like the careful folding of cloth or the measured turning of a kiln. At the center of this chapter is Temiloluwa, a middle-aged woman whose role in her compound bridged household management, mentorship of apprentices, and preparation for ceremonial events. She was not a priestess or a trader of great renown. Her influence came from coordination, consistency, and patience, ensuring that each thread of domestic and ceremonial life reinforced the others. Temiloluwa's mornings began with small, deliberate actions, checking the loom tension, inspecting indigo vats, and quietly reminding apprentices of yesterday's lessons. She moved slowly, almost meditatively, performing each task with precision. The apprentices observed, learning not only technique but the subtle rhythm of daily life, which she maintained without overt instruction. Family and craft were inseparable. Children participated in minor tasks, gradually learning the patterns of work that governed the compound. They fetched water, prepared fibers, or assisted in folding ceremonial cloth, all under the gentle guidance of Temiloluwa. Through these daily routines, they absorbed a philosophy of slow attention, quiet observation, and careful repetition. Ceremonial preparation was integrated seamlessly into this rhythm. Festivals, naming ceremonies, and seasonal rituals were not isolated events, but natural extensions of ongoing work. Temiloluwa coordinated the preparation of ceremonial cloth, arranging for apprentices to tie and dye in stages that aligned with both household tasks and the larger festival calendar. Timing was essential. Cloth needed to be ready for rituals precisely when the community required it, but the work itself was unhurried, deliberate, and patient. Temiloluwa also managed subtle social interactions. Visiting artisans, elders, and neighbors were treated with gentle respect. Agreements for small exchanges of cloth or dye materials were conducted quietly, with minimal verbal negotiation. These interactions reinforced a sense of stability and continuity within the community, maintaining social bonds without tension or urgency. Her personal life mirrored the philosophy of her household. She married a quietly capable man who shared responsibilities in the compound. Their relationship was steady, companionable, and unremarkable to outsiders, which suited both of them perfectly. Children learned not only craft techniques but the value of patience, observation, and slow adaptation to daily and seasonal rhythms. Over decades, Temalauyua became a quiet anchor for the compound. Apprentices who joined her household gradually absorbed the intertwined rhythms of craft, family, and ceremonial preparation. Errors were corrected with gentle demonstration rather than reprimand. Tasks were sequenced according to environmental conditions and social needs, teaching newcomers that life's pace is dictated not by urgency but by careful attention to the natural flow of work and community expectation. By the time she aged and passed on responsibilities to the next generation, Temalauyua had instilled a consistent, patient methodology in both people and process. Looms continued to click, indigo vats continued to ferment, ceremonial cloth continued to be prepared with exacting care, and apprentices carried forward the lessons of quiet rhythm. Her influence was embedded not in records, accolades, or public recognition, but in the stable, deliberate pulse of everyday life, which sustained the community across years and generations. As we drift further through the gentle world of Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kills, Chapter 17 examines the gradual, almost imperceptible transmission of craft knowledge across generations. Here, history is not made by dramatic events or sudden innovations, but by decades of patient apprenticeship, quiet observation, and repeated practice. Our focus is on Abiola, a woman whose life spanned nearly 7 decades of teaching, weaving, dyeing, and mentoring. She was not a leader in the political sense, nor a figure celebrated beyond her community. Her influence was quiet, subtle, and profound, embedded in the daily work of those around her. Abiola began her training as a child, sitting beside her mother while observing the rhythm of loom and vat. Unlike dramatic apprenticeships recorded in chronicles, her early lessons were absorbed slowly, through imitation and gentle correction. She watched patterns emerge, noticed how slight changes in folding or dye immersion affected results, and internalized a philosophy of patient repetition. As a teenager, Abiola took on small responsibilities, preparing fibers, assisting with dyeing, and occasionally tying ceremonial cloth under supervision. Mistakes were expected and gently corrected. There was no rush, no shouting, no urgent need for perfection. Every error was part of the long, slow curriculum of craft mastery, teaching her attention, timing, and resilience. By adulthood, Abiola had become a competent artisan. But her true skill lay not in technical ability alone. It was in her capacity to observe subtle cues, anticipate problems, and teach others quietly. Apprentices under her guidance learned to feel the tension of fibers, to sense the absorption rate of indigo, and to fold cloth in ways that honored both function and ceremonial significance. Family life intertwined seamlessly with her apprenticeship work. Children and younger siblings learned by assisting, observing, and practicing. Mistakes were gently corrected, rhythms were repeated daily, and continuity was emphasized over speed or spectacle. In this way, knowledge was embedded in both craft and household life, forming a natural bridge between generations. Abiola's influence extended to ceremonial preparation as well. She ensured that ceremonial cloth was tied and dyed in accordance with traditional patterns, timed to align with festivals and rituals. Every fold, every knot, every dip in the vat was both functional and symbolic, subtly reinforcing community cohesion and social rhythm. Apprentices watched her quietly, learning the nuances of timing, pattern, and ceremonial appropriateness without being told explicitly. Even in her later years, Abiola remained a calm presence. She observed the work of apprentices, adjusted dye consistency, and offered gentle guidance. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, yet with a precision born of decades of experience. The younger generation internalized her methods, not through verbal instruction alone, but through the silent rhythm of her movements, her touch, and her measured pace. Her legacy was not inscribed in records or monuments. It lived in the steady rhythm of the compound. Looms clicked predictably, indigo vats fermented consistently, ceremonial cloth was prepared on time, and apprentices continued to learn through patient observation and repetition. In this way, Abiola ensured that the knowledge of generations before her persisted without fanfare or urgency. As we leave Abiola's compound, the lesson of this chapter becomes clear. The slow transmission of skill, patience, and observation is as vital to continuity as any dramatic event or celebrated innovation. The quiet hands of artisans, moving at their own deliberate pace, maintain the pulse of community life, ceremonial integrity, and generational knowledge. As we continue our gentle drift through Yoruba loom houses and Nubian kilns, Chapter 18 focuses on the broader rhythms of community life, where craft, household management, and ceremonial preparation intersect. Here, influence is rarely dramatic or conspicuous. It is embedded in daily practice, patient observation, and the steady flow of work across families and compounds. At the center of this chapter is Funmileo, a woman whose quiet coordination helped maintain cohesion across multiple households. She was not an official leader, nor widely recognized outside her community. Her role was subtle. She ensured that ceremonial cloth, market preparations, and household routines moved in harmony, gently guiding apprentices and family members without imposing loudly or abruptly. Her mornings began with a quiet inspection of the loom houses. She noted which apprentices had begun work, which vats of indigo were ready for dipping, and which fibers required attention. Each task was sequenced carefully, accounting for environmental conditions, apprentices' skill levels, and upcoming ceremonial needs. Funmileo's movements were deliberate, her instructions minimal, but her presence shaped the day's rhythm in profound ways. Family life was intertwined seamlessly with craft. Children and younger relatives assisted in folding, tying, and preparing fibers, gradually absorbing techniques and philosophy through observation and gentle correction. Mistakes were opportunities for slow learning rather than sources of frustration. The household functioned as a living classroom, where patience, attention, and careful repetition were values reinforced through routine. Ceremonial preparation was particularly dependent on Funmileo's subtle coordination. Festivals, naming ceremonies, and other rituals required cloth to be ready at precise moments, folded and tied according to long-standing tradition. Funmileo ensured that timing, pattern, and ritual sequence were maintained without haste or fuss. The cloth itself guided the rhythm of ceremonies, signaling roles, paths, and social hierarchy in a quiet, unobtrusive manner. Trade and market interaction were also shaped by her careful attention. Small-scale exchanges of cloth or dye materials with neighboring compounds occurred without urgency. Funmileo's calm oversight ensured that agreements proceeded smoothly, apprentices learned social negotiation, and the integrity of ceremonial preparation was never compromised by external pressures. Her influence extended across multiple generations of apprentices who absorbed lessons not only in craft but in how to move patiently through daily life, how to observe environmental cues, and how to integrate household, ritual, and community responsibilities. Through her measured guidance, apprentices learned that work is most effective when aligned with rhythm rather than forced pace. Even her personal life reflected this philosophy. Funmileo's household operated on quiet coordination rather than dramatic intervention. Relationships were stable, companionable, and aligned with the slow unfolding of daily work. Her children and younger relatives internalized this approach, learning the value of patience, observation, and deliberate action. By the time Funmileo reached her later years, the compound was a model of steady, interwoven rhythms. Looms moved predictably. Vats fermented consistently. Ceremonial cloth arrived on time. Apprentices moved with confidence and subtle intuition. Her legacy was not public recognition, but the smooth, enduring flow of life across her household and community, maintained through observation, patience, and gentle guidance. As we leave Funmileo's compound, the lesson of this chapter is evident. The rhythm of craft, household, and ceremonial life is maintained by patient, consistent attention, and the quiet influence of those who guide without drama. Communities continue, generations persist, and culture is preserved, not through spectacle, but through the slow pulse of ordinary, deliberate action.